Thank you. Thanks a lot, Shubh, for getting this panel going. It's a great pleasure. Thanks for the idea of having Cape Town conversation. And this is an extremely important panel in the day where we are going to take the idea of Global South forward. And our concept and idea that has come up is largely in terms of how we look at this engagement that has already been discussed since yesterday. We are also trying to see how the whole concept of Africa joining the G20 table, able to contribute, and also thinking in terms of how the change, how the performance, how the larger architecture, the financial architecture, the economic landscape that we are talking of for the Global South would change. And as we know, at this point, roughly 2/3 of the global population is covered by G20. Around 85% of GDP G20 covers and 75% of global trade. But with the addition of AU on the table, we expect the population coverage would go up to 77%. GDP would go up to 88%, so 3% addition in the GDP. And the trade share, almost same percent, so it would be 78%. But the population coverage would jump almost from 60% to 77%. So a large number of people would be benefited, and a large gain we are expecting in terms of how this would deliver. As the Kenyan president described this as Africa's voice, visibility, and influence. And the idea is that the AU's addition would bring in this. The reality is that Africa is bearing this disproportionate burden of impact of climate change, and that I think would be extremely important. The challenge here is also in terms of AU's preparedness. To what extent AU is prepared to play that role with the institutions, what kind of knowledge institutions, how do we bring in coherence, how do we bring in experiences that we have seen in the past. And as we all know, Africa has played an extremely important role in terms of coping up with global financial crisis. The C10 that came up had the Central Bank of West African States and the Central Bank of Central African States, supported by AFDB, the Economic Commission of Africa, and also the African Union Commission. So there have been institutional support mechanisms which have strengthened Africa's ability to handle the global challenges, opportunities, and that I think is important in terms of how we look at the new opportunities that are there. As we heard the AU President Azali Assoumani, in terms of bringing in the larger investment opportunities, the larger opportunities in terms of bringing in more employment, more responsible resources, and also his call for having internal investments in Africa. So G20's focus on Africa, G20's ability to bring in the challenges, the changes that we are looking at, and how we see this opportunity going to contribute in terms of this new addition on the big table of G20, where AU was already especially invited international organization, but now they would sit in full swing as member of the sort of community which is deciding on several different dimensions and providing direction in terms of how we go forward. So I have extremely accomplished panel today that brings in fantastic insights in terms of how we go forward. What are the options they see in terms of bringing in the opportunity right at the door of each of the 54 member organization? How do we bring in coherence? and what kind of preparedness is required for next 2 to 3 years as we see the G20 presidency moving from India to Brazil. We just did the handing over ceremony for the T20, the Think 20. And then, of course, the presidency coming to South Africa before it ends up in the United States of America. So I think with this excellent panel, let me bring in Professor Sarah, who has been thinking about the issues which are of great significance in terms of her own ability to see the dimensions of engagement as former Commissioner of Human Resources, Science and Technology for African Union, and somebody who has seen AUs working very closely, somebody who has been looking into the way these challenges are to be addressed and how we can bring in a more coherent voice on G20 from African Union. So, Professor Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much. I stand on existing protocol. Good morning, everyone. Indeed, as the theme of this plenary session says, time for Africa, AU in the G20. Now, given my experience, I believe that the G20 within the African Union has, and as we have moved from the presidencies from India to Brazil, and we'll come to South Africa in 2025, what can we expect in these 3 years of consecutive global South presidencies before the USA? So the first thing I want to say is that African Union's G20 benefits are enormous. And joining the G20, because I was very lucky to listen to the Minister of Foreign Affairs when she was speaking, and I think she has already echoed all our ideas and what we need to do. I think her conversation, her speech was frank and actually nails the points that we need to look at. So, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, what do we expect? What do we want? What can we see? How do we move forward? Collaboration among African Union and regional blocs present opportunities to address key issues for the continent's development, be it economic integration, infrastructure development, and coordinated efforts on healthcare and education can amplify impact, particularly in science, technology, and innovation. I use the word science, technology, and innovation because I believe that these factors are the threshold on any economy or country's development. When we speak of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, it is that vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa dreamed by its own competent and skilled citizens. How do we go about this? Without solidifying our foundation in education, in science, in technology, and in innovation. Beyond this, shared strategies for conflict resolution and fostering good governance is important because where there is no peace, there will be no sustainable development. So additionally, we need to leverage technology for sustainable development and fostering intra-African trade, and this can actually contribute significantly to the continent's growth. But speaking about that, we also need to walk the talk, going beyond rhetorics. The African Union needs also to take responsibilities of what they need to do as Africans first, and then what they need to do collectively in the spirit of Ubuntu, that I am because you are, when they come to the G20. And that is the African Renaissance that we are talking about. So, as Her Excellency did say, she said it very well, that Africa needs to have its own, is it G20? Africa needs to have its own African aid and above that. So the G20 will give us the opportunity for us to fulfill our dream on the African continent, as well as the G20 fulfilling its own focus on inclusivity. And that is what African participation will bring. Then beyond this, the other thing that we need to look at is Africa working collectively in leveraging its new status within the new membership that it has. And this can be articulated well. In the African Union Commission, we have 6 departments. These 6 different departments speaks to the challenges we have in Africa. And they are there to coordinate efforts and strategies and policies that will leverage or bridge the gap concerning these various areas that we face challenges. And it needs to be contextualized and domesticated, because from one region to the other, from one country to the other, it is not the same story. So we have departments like the agriculture, rural development, blue economy, and sustainable development. We have economic development, tourism, trade, industry, and mining. These two departments were restructured during the 2021 reform of the African Union. And then we have the infrastructure and energy, we have education, science, technology, and innovation, health and humanitarian affairs, and political affairs. And when you look at all this, they are all areas that we find the G20 working on to promote sustainable development in the global world. So the African Union coming to join the G20 now is a welcome intervention, because before then, only South Africa represented the continent in the G20. But now, 55 member states are under this, and they will function very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor Sarah. Excellent articulation in terms of how the 6 departments within AU would take forward the agenda that you have outlined. I'm so glad that you have emphasized on science, technology, and innovation. You have emphasized on education, and you have emphasized on sustainability. I think they are absolutely important dimensions in the Sherpa track. And as you know, in G20, the other track, which is extremely important, is the finance track. And how do we bring in finance track there, I think is absolutely important for us to take it forward. But I would come back to you on this issue later as to how finance track can be taken in the African Union's performance. But here is someone who has seen it very closely, and Saeed, I'm looking at you in terms of how you are advising and taking forward the working as you work very closely with the chair and the president. So your idea in terms of how the Pan-African network of think tanks, you have been very closely involved. You have also been very closely involved in terms of the performance of the African Union. So how you see, say, this dimension getting shaped, and how the delivery would actually happen? Can I turn it to you now? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks to ORF for having me again on this very important discussion. I would like first to thank the Indian government for helping the AU on this process. It was very difficult. But before that, I have to remind you that this process starts with many other previous chairpersons, where there was President Cyril Ramaphosa, President Tshisekedi, and then Macky Sall. All of them went in the same path to make sure AU became full member of the G20. So for Comoros, it was something, our president from the beginning on day one, he said, we have to make sure it's happen. So what we did is he divided the 20 member, as you know, is 19 countries and 1 AU as a general organization. So we focused on the country. We didn't make sure they will fully support us. And he sent a special envoy, and we work with all of them. So what was very surprising is we always receive a very warm welcome and very, I want to say, agreement. We will fully support you. Then my question is, why we took so long to fix this unfair situation? We should be on the table from the beginning. We have more the resources. We have the population. We have the thing that fueled the global economy, but we're outside of the table. So now we are inside. There is many stakes remaining. Among them is, first, we Africans need to make sure who will sit on the table. Because as you know, the commission is itself, the president is elected for 4 years, and the chairperson is just appointed for 1 year. So we have a huge conversation on should we let the Commission lead or should we put the President? And I remember having the conversation with my President. The advisor around him were telling him, we think he should be the President because it's more important. But our President answered us, no, we don't need the President and we don't need the President of the Commission. We need a special envoy who can be appointed for 2 years and focus on this mission. It's very important to make sure we have someone who will be dedicated to the G20 and make sure he delivers. Because every time we have a promise from the North, every time, whether it's about the debt, it's about development, infrastructure, healthcare, but it's very hard to deliver. So for our president, and I think that needs to be shared with everybody within the African Union, we should not appoint the president of the commission, neither the chairman of the conference of the president. We should find someone who will be dedicated on this and make sure he delivers. That's the first important point I think we need to make sure it's happened. Then, I think becoming member of G20, we were very pleased, but it's just one fair situation we fix among many unfair situations that need to be fixed very quickly. And as you know, if we talk about the financial architecture, the SDR, the special drawing right, Germany itself has the same right as the whole continent in terms of editing those special rights. So it's not fair. We need to fix it. It's not sustainable. It's not about justice. It's about just to make the mechanism work. If we don't fix it, Germany itself cannot have the same right as 1.4 billion people. We need to find a solution. That's one point. Coming from an island, we have a very important issue on climate change. Climate change, blue economy, it's very important on the agenda. And as you said, how we Africans can change the global agenda and make sure the agenda is work for the whole world, but also work for Africans. That's why we fought for that. We fought to make sure we will be heard, and not only heard, but also put in practice the issue of global climate change, because we are the first one suffering from that. One of the ideas that we put on the table is why we don't create a bank for climate change, bank for disaster. We are the ones who are suffering most of on the climate change, on natural disaster. Kenya itself proposed to host this bank and is working on mechanism that African countries can contribute, but also we need also donors and other people to put on the table some funds to make sure we have a specific mechanism that can be very quick, very efficient for African countries facing climate change. And then one of the big challenges remain the Security Council. It cannot continue anymore. The last time President Biden went to India and declared he will pledge for changing the situation, making sure India became member of the Security Council. That's a good idea, but he was saying that because of China. And we Africans, we also need to be on the table, and we need to make sure we change the global governance. So, of course, we heard Her Excellency Minister of Foreign Affairs from South Africa saying previously, many Western countries are very happy to go in Zambia, Congo, or Tanzania for raw materials. But this situation needs to change. You need the raw materials, so please, let's sit down and talk about how we can build the factory in Africa and make sure the job and the value add is from the continent. So those are some key questions we need to challenge and make sure we deliver on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Said. Big hand to him. I think you have made very important point, both in terms of the internal governance that is required and the idea of having specific responsibilities, but also AU navigating this crucial balancing act that AU would have to do as a member. And I think this would be absolutely important. Friends and colleagues, as we know, the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies has emerged as one of the major think tanks in the region. And as AU prepares for this new role, think tanks and research institutions have a major responsibility. Dr. Latif, we are extremely delighted to have you with us as Executive Director of this very important research institution. Your own specialization in the realm of finance is extremely important, something that I was mentioning to Professor Sarah on how we see delivery by AU both on Sherpa track as well as on finance track. And here we see your role and your idea in terms of how the financial architecture can be reshaped, and in what way you see this role being addressed by African Union. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's working. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's not working. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to the Cape Town conversation. It's a pleasure to be for the first time in this beautiful country and in this beautiful city. And before starting, I want to thank Her Excellency, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on her position towards Palestine. As an Egyptian, Arab, and an African, I was very touched by the correct position there. Okay, let me, before answering the question specifically about the finance and the financial architecture and the role of the EU, let me start by saying that Africa joining the EU is a very big win on both sides. This was already mentioned by my two colleagues, but let me be very specific. What does G20 bring to the EU? A lot. The G20 is supposed to be, under the present system, the platform for solving problems, setting the rules of the game, and definitely, instead of being in the periphery on meetings, being an actual member makes a big difference. Putting the rules of the game is more beneficial and more important for the smaller countries than the bigger countries, thus its entry is important for Africa. Africa brings a lot to the G20. Okay? For starters, it brings more legitimacy for G20 because of the regional representation. It brings a young population, which means a huge consumer market, and this in itself is a magnet for supply chain investments. It also brings richness in minerals, which are necessary for achieving the green transformation in the world. Okay? And so this is actually a very big plus. So it's a win on both sides, and it was demanded and requested many times before. All right, on the finance part, in order to answer your question, specific question, and whether the EU can have a role in changing the financial infrastructure, there are some efforts in that direction right now. I think the answer to that question lies actually at 3 levels, and it's very important to see them this way, otherwise it doesn't work. Level 0, which is necessary, the EU cannot make any difference anywhere if it does not have its own positioning in the G20. Okay? Not just being a member by name, but being a member by action. And being a member by action means that it needs to have a common position as a continent. And that's not very easy. That's a big challenge of arranging the house inside, because there is a conflict between the national interests and the regional or continental interest. As already mentioned by Dr. Sayed, islands are different from continental countries. Landlocked countries are different from the coastal ones. Developed countries are different from the less developed ones, which do not have access to electricity or access to clean cooking. Those differences are huge. It's important to have a good leadership, but it's important to support that leadership, to have discussions, internal discussions, in order to have a common position that makes the EU capable of making any difference inside the G20. Without the common positioning, it will not be able to move forward. And I hope that Africa surprises the world by actually doing that. This was level 0, all right? Level 1, if you want the EU to make any difference in the financial infrastructure, it has to be relieved from its foreign debt burden. It has a huge foreign debt burden, all the countries there. And I'm not talking about the burden of debt to China. This is a commercial one. But I'm talking about the debt to the World Bank and the debt to the IMF. This can be actually cancelled because the continent has been used, let's not say abused, I'll just say used, by the rest of the world forever, okay? And we all know the situation with the climate, that we're contributing no more than 3% of the damage, but we are subject to all the ills related with the climate deterioration. So this is level 1. Level 2, and it's really the most important and the most critical, and I'm being very blunt because I'm an economist, I'm not a politician, all right? So this is how I protect myself. I don't think the EU or anybody else, okay, can make a change in the financial infrastructure, okay? Because the change in the financial infrastructure that's being discussed by everybody is taking place within the existing economic system, within the present multilateral system. And it really doesn't make any sense that you are asking the very same institutions that have advantages because of their position to actually personally and on their own step back, okay, and give more for the others. It's not going to work, okay? So neither the EU nor anybody else. The EU can and should play a role if it is ready, but because of this, it's not possible. What is needed, seriously needed, is a complete change in the present system. The present system is like a small box where you are trying to fit an elephant. And the elephant is everything that's happening in the world. The IMF, the World Bank, cannot continue to operate on a voting system that based on the amount of money that is put as share. The Bretton Woods Agreement, which took place after the Second World War, cannot be the one that is guiding the world now. It's completely different. The Global South has 80% of the population and very highly developed countries of their own. So it needs a serious change. This is the precondition for any change in the financial system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Latif. I think you have captured the large essence and also have highlighted the limitations that are there for the kind of changes that one may envisage and how we go forward in terms of both bringing in rigor in the intervention that the presidency may require at that particular point, but how we bring in the international financial institutions shaping this trajectory for such a change. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Let me now turn to Anita.
Can I add one word, please? Because I think it's very important. I hope that the G20 in Brazil actually will be able to make a difference in that, because the changes in the international system needed, someone with the guts of Lula da Silva is the one that can push forward this.
And we heard all the three great voices from the G20, and they have similarly emphasized this. I think it's great. Anita, you have been somebody who has been very active on environmental issues, both as a very consistent, committed thinker, but also very action-oriented. I wanted to ask you, what would be your recommendation to African Union as they occupy this position? How you view both as a demographer, but also as somebody who is absolutely fascinated with this idea of sustainability. So over to you, Anita.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the role that the most affected groups, and that include youths and women and children, play in shaping our collective future, and that's in the African continent. From the speech that we had today from Her Excellency, the Minister of International Relations in South Africa, she really talked much about the role of young people and how the African continent is rich with the youthful population. And I think for me is to also say that most of the times we stop at calling the most affected people victims, but then we forget that they don't stop at being victims of climate change, but are also at the forefront in providing solutions. Looking at the AU, I think for me it's more of, there's a quote that says, don't ask what your country will do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And in this case, I will speak about the role of young people in also supporting the AU in achieving climate commitments at the G20. And citing the previous the just concluded inaugural Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, where young people came together to organize an African Youth Climate Assembly that was not coming to ask the leaders about what they want to do for the youth, but literally to showcase the innovations that young people across the African continent have. And that way we were able to bring the President of Africa Development Bank and the President of the Republic of Kenya for them to have an engagement with young people. And we presented a youth declaration that was mainstreamed at the President's declaration, which the ask to the AU was basically to mainstream gender issues, to mainstream youth in their climate discussions. And that will still remain the same, is to make sure that the AU puts the communities that are on the forefront of experiencing what's effects of climate change on the table, because if they are not on the table, then they are definitely on the menu. We want to see the most affected communities being engaged, tapping into the indigenous knowledge and understanding how, for a very long time, even without involving them, how have they been able to build resilience and when it comes to adapting to the existing climate change effects. And another thing, of course, is to say that as we move forward, ahead of COP28, the African Women for Climate have also written what their asks are to the AU when it comes to mainstreaming gender in climate issues. So just to make sure that these are taken into action and into consideration, making sure that the most affected are really on the table of the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Anita. Thank you. Thanks for bringing in the issue of youth and climate change on table. Friends and colleagues, we had this excellent round with our panel. We have discussed what AU's addition in G20, making it G21, what kind of trade, GDP, population coverage it brings on table. We discussed about AU's own structure, the departments that are there that Professor Sarah explained, Said mentioned in terms of how this cooperation can go forward. He also emphasized in terms of the delicate balancing act that AU would do. We also heard Dr. Latif telling us about the financial architecture, the rules and the binding commitments that are there. And then Anita told us in terms of expectations of the youth and the commitment for climate change. We are left with few minutes now, and I would very much encourage if anyone has any clarification, voice, any concern, just please give your introduction and please be as brief as possible, because I have only 7 minutes and I would very much like to go back to the panel for their response. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Youssef Ramrani, the ambassador of Morocco in South Africa. Thank you very much for the panelists. I think it was a very interesting discussion. I believe that we, as African Union, as Africans, we need these relations with G20. We believe that it is a platform for us to exchange our expertise and to develop a platform of cooperation, and also an opportunity to explain our interests in this very complex world and how we could reshape it. But we have to be, I would like to be very sincere with you. We need, first of all, to do our own homework as Africans. And I think the lady has already said it, because the priority for us today is to develop a strong, ambitious, and prosperous Africa. We need to work for the regional integration schemes, because working together, we can move forward. And I think what was said by the lady, that she said exactly the same thing, that we need to work, to do our own homework, to build up this strong Africa.
Thank you.
And I will finish by saying that the most important for us, of course, is the creation of jobs, promotion of growth, but also to think how to change this multilateralism. Thank you.
Absolutely right. Dot there. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Any other intervention? Any other observation? I don't see any hands. This is such an exciting topic. Why no one is coming forward? Yes, I see. Please take the floor and come over.
Thank you so much. My name is Camille Fiormain from Benin, a member of the Global Diplomacy Lab. Thank you for this session. My first question is regarding how Africa as a continent is enabling the free movement of its own people. Because we are talking about conversation. And it's good for us really to challenge our leaders to ensure that the free movement of people in Africa is a reality, for us to be able to actively contribute to this kind of conversation in the G20.
Thank you.
The second question is...
I think let's have just one question. There's one more person there. Yeah, please take the floor. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Amor Maclang, Digital Pilipinas and Digital ASEAN. Between the 600 million people in ASEAN, which I feel does not have enough of a conversation with the African Union. I think we're like perfect lovers, twin siblings. Our issues are the same, and yet we don't feel like we have enough voice in the AU conversation. How can we change that? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to the panel now. Okay, this is the last one, and just please be as brief as possible.
Yes, I'm Jules Samoti from International Red Cross. Thank you for the presentations. My point is, how can we implement all of this without stability, peace, and security on the continent? Because one of the presenters said we have many conflicts in Africa, which is true, more than 35 armed conflicts on the continent. How this can happen without stabilizing the continent? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Let me turn to the panel, and Professor Sarah, let me begin with you.
Thank you very much. I don't know, but as you're asking this question, the last speaker and the one that, and my brother who spoke about the mobility in Africa, there's only one song I can sing to answer that question. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free ourselves, because we need to have ownership. The African passport is one of the flagship of the African Union. Yet, the Africans themselves, you go to certain countries, they don't recognize the African Union passport. That is one. Secondly, how do we stop these conflicts within Africa, among our countries, even within the countries themselves? How can we stop the divide, this segregation, them and us, etc.? It is us changing, having a mind paradigm shift. Our leaders having ownership, speaking the talk, walking the talk, and going beyond rhetorics. Not lip service, not eye service, but action on the ground, changing the lives of people. It is very, very important. It is Achebe that says that we need to see where the rain started beating us. Because if we do not ourselves diagnose our issues, there is no doctor that will diagnose it for you. You have to speak the truth, transparency, accountability. That is the only thing that can give us that vision of the Africa we want, that integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa. And that peacefulness, a man that is hungry will never be peaceful. Give our youth employment, and then they will no longer hold the guns. Silencing the guns is not holding the guns. Silence their hunger, silence unemployment, silence the different gender infrastructure within the country, and then we'll be able to realize the African dream. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We are left with 1 minute, 47 seconds. Dr. Latif, may I turn to you now, please?
Yes, I just want very quickly to comment on the very last question, saying that there are lots of conflicts. What are the solutions? I think there is a very important role that has to be played by research in Africa to find solutions. Research that compares, quantifies the benefit from balancing things to, in comparison to looking at your narrow national interest only. This requires serious research by think tanks. That's not happening. The continent is overstudied and understudied at the same time, and most of the studies are done by outsiders and not by its own people. So it's a key issue. And as long as we are going to keep on playing on the financial issue within the system, we are dealing with the symptom of the problem, not the core, so it will never be solved and it will never be fair. Thank you. you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Latif. Anita, any quick response on any question that you heard? Any reaction? Any further idea?
Thank you
Just
very
few
much.
seconds.
Yeah, I think
We are
mine
left
is,
with the-
yes, mine is to just not really pick on any question, but to conclude by saying that as we continue to speak about the power of young people, let's not just stop at speaking about it, and let's not use the young people to tick a box that they were present in this place, but let's literally make sure that we meaningfully engage and tap into their power. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Thanks a lot. Saeed, the major responsibility comes to you. The first question in terms of how do we bring in more momentum to our homework? And that's the question that you started with when you made your comments. Let me turn that question to you, please.
Thank you very much. I think it's an open conversation. The AU itself do its best to make sure African citizens are involved, whether through the regional organization or the continental organization. Think tanks and this kind of gathering help to produce knowledge and ideas that help the continent and the organization to move forward. One thing on should we wait to make a peace before we develop the continent? I would like to tell my brother, it doesn't work like that. We try to do everything at the same time. We don't have the luxury to wait until we reach a peace and then we can develop the continent. It's a spreading in the Sahel, in the horn of the continent, and we do our best to make sure we silence it again. At the same time, we fight for the called justice, global governance. So the tasks are huge, and we have to continue.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Saeed. There is no scope for me to summarize, but certainly, Saeed, I think you have helped me in terms of capturing the essence, in terms of what homework is required. With almost 12 working groups in G20 and equal number of engagement groups, both Dr. Latif and Professor Sarah have emphasized in terms of bringing in more gravitas to our preparation. As you, Professor Sarah, very rightly mentioned that we need technical people to come in. And there is this huge intellectual base that Africa already has. Dr. Latif, you emphasized on heterogeneity across countries, coastal countries, landlocked countries, and many other dimensions that you spoke of. We would need to collate their energies, bring in the gravitas for this larger performance that Anita was expecting for youth and on climate change. So a big hand for my panel, and I hope we have done good on time as well, Shub.
Okay, working now. Thank you so much, Professor Chaturvedi, and thank you so much for the panel. To the panel, if I could request you to join us for a quick photograph. Thank you. The next session, we'll move swiftly to that. It's reformed multilateralism, pivoting towards equitable development. We will be discussing the reform process of the UN and of the multilateral development banks. I think MDB reform has been a key theme again of the G20 process. On the panel, we will have Tito Mboweni, former finance minister of South Africa, Isabella Teixeira, trustee emeritus at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, or SEBRI, and the former environment minister of Brazil, Ambassador Sujan Chenoy, Director General of Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, and Chair of the Think 20 India. We also have Andreas Schall from the OECD. He's the OECD Sherpa for G20, G7, and APEC. And the moderator, Moy Rafael, Head of Division of Multilateral Development Policy, G7, G20, OECD DAC at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. If I could request the moderator and the speakers to take their seats. As we did in the previous panel and on the panel last evening, we do have 2 mics on either side of the room. We have 7 to 8 minutes at the end of each session for Q&A from the audience for an interaction with the panel, so please do line up. The moderator will also make that announcement. Reformed multilateralism, pivoting towards equitable development. On the panel, Tito Mboweni, former finance minister of South Africa, Isabella Teixeira, trustee emeritus at SEBRI, Ambassador Sujan Chenoy, From India, Andrea Schall from the OECD, and Moira Fail from Germany. Moderator, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these kind introductions, and also for already introducing the panel, the distinguished panel we have with us today. I'm very honored to be able to moderate this session with you. We have been asked to discuss a little more detail today the question of reformed multilateralism, how we're pivoting towards equitable development. And I think this session fits neatly in the process of the Cape Town conference so far. Yesterday we spent a lot of time discussing G20 and BRICS, and I think what we were aiming to do now is to also take a broader view of the multilateral system. We have heard also, of course, a call for reform, a clear call for reform, the need that we need the system, and we need the multilateral institutions to deliver, to become fairer to a certain extent. And in this wake, I would like to maybe begin by asking the panelists in the first round, briefly, if you would like to pick out a change you would like to see in the multilateral system. So if we look at starting from a broad perspective, how we can both make it more equitable, but also more effective in delivering for sustainable development. Where would you start, or where do you see the main impetus that we will need at the moment in this current times, which we have heard a lot about this morning? The context is very difficult, but it is also very dynamic. So starting with this question, perhaps I will head over to Minister Tito Mboweni. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here for the Cape Town conversation. I think a lot has been said yesterday by President Mbeki, and also I think during the course of this morning about the unequal treatment of developing countries by the developed countries. I think the question that arises is not how to complain, it's what to do. Because we have been sending petitions and so on, but these are not being replied to. So the key issue really is, can we develop other institutions which will then relate to the existing institutions in the process of change? My experience has been that of the formation of the G20 and also the BRICS system. And within the G20 system, our approach was, let us bring together those countries which are systemically important for the financial system, global financial system, so that we're not just reliant on those institutions and countries of the North, but also we can also use our own positions to influence the direction of movement. And within the G20 system, the original idea obviously was that we bring these systemically important countries. Actually, it was the ministers of finance and the governors of central banks which were in the G20 system. Then we made a mistake. We began to issue statements, and the heads of states got jealous, and they took over the organization, the G20. So it has become something else now. But within that G20 system, there was something that we called reporting on the observance of standards and codes. Now, that system was meant to help to ensure that we all move in the same direction. And then with the BRICS system, again, our attempt was not to undermine the IMF and the World Bank, but to provide a caucus so that when we go to the meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, we have a common position of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And again, it was the governors and the ministers of finance who were meeting before the meetings of the IMF and the World Bank to caucus a common position. Again, we made a mistake. We started issuing statements, and the heads of states got jealous. They also took that over into the BRICS thing. Now it's got big. But the final point I want to make was that given the difficulties which developing countries were experiencing with the IMF and the World Bank, we decided to form this thing called the BRICS Bank. In fact, the official name is New Development Bank, not BRICS Bank. Not to compete with the IMF or the World Bank, but in a sense, to provide a new way of thinking, which probably will also influence the behavior and approach of the IMF and the World Bank. Let me leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. So if we look at the institutions, and we heard this morning that Brazil will be looking particularly at the theme of inequality. So if you would like to look at the question of equitable access to institutions, I find it quite interesting that we have not so far heard the word General Assembly in this conference, because I think if there's one institution with one country, one vote that is most equitable, we have that. But there's a lot of hope and a lot of aspiration looking at formats like G20 and BRICS and others, and we strive to make these formats inclusive and as possible. But from your perspective, Isabel Teixeira, when we look at the question of equitable development, what would you like to see in the way of reform in the multilateral system, and what expectations do you have regarding formats like the G20 or the BRICS, maybe vis-a-vis more traditional institutions?
Well, let's see. I think that we need to observe the big picture that multilateral system is facing today, consider different lands. And when we had in the past the multilateral system, you didn't have the crisis with nature as we have today. And this is so disruptive because it's not only based on the vulnerabilities and risks, but also in which countries would be able to access natural resource to make sure that they can provide development and inclusive growth. When you go into Europe, for example, you don't have the strategic reserves on minerals. Okay, it is true, but you have a carbon footprint 10 times bigger than the rest of the world, developing world. So if you want to change how Europeans and North, global North, are eager to change your footprints and to change your lifestyles. And this means international cooperation. Because when you go into global south, and you need to understand when you design it in a multilateral system, the climate regime and the biodiversity regime, this is the big picture of the crisis that we have today. Because we have the north with climate, and the south with the assets on biodiversity and natural resource. And if you want to provide solutions, we need to repicture things to understand what is the big picture today that must be changed. Of course that we have CBDR, common by differentiated responsibility, etc., but you need to discuss what we have today in such a way that you can figure out not only innovative institutional arrangements, but also how international community should, must, and could come together when you go into this kind of debate. I'm not discussing here hard power, okay? This is another phase of multilateral system, and we're dealing with this today, okay? I'm discussing here how you come, as you provoke me if you understand, to deal with inequality is not only social inequality, it is also environmental inequalities. People will not be able to access natural resources in the future. And the other side of the coin is that we are getting older, we have longevity. We need to understand the demands, additional demands of natural resources, that unfortunately we are not able to manage this, considering what we have today. So we need to come into this new reality. It's a global planetary dimension, and to understand that the challenge for developed banks, for finance system, how vulnerable we are, considering this disruptive crisis that we are facing today. So the international community and the international multilateral systems took decision in the past considering sustainability. And this, we need to make sure that we can have sustainability as a new expression of humanism in the world. Solidarity is part of this equation, but we need to understand how unbalanced we are today, and we need to recognize our mistakes, the both sides, okay? To make sure that we can go into the future with better alliance, and to make sure that the like-minded arrangements like G20, BRICS Plus, and other ones that are coming, okay? Why this is happening? Because we have new international dynamics in the world, new interests, new perspectives, new geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. My last comment, we cannot forget when you go into G20 or BRICS Plus, our GDP is bigger than G7. The world changed, and we need to understand how the world changed, and also the complexity that we have today. This year, next year, will be more complicated than this year. And then, but we cannot face the challenge on nature, and also another social inequality. Just what is justice for my country is not necessary for your country in Germany, okay? I understand this very well. But I think that we need to have an open-minded perspective to debate how would you like to come together, consider the future. That's why I mentioned earlier to have the future and the present, and to understand that the past is still with a real weight, but we need to understand that we need to change if you're not able to come together. We need to change if you want to have a new multilateral system. We need to change our mindset, our behavior, and to understand, as he's mentioned, the role of these new dynamics, economic dynamics in the world. Because, and my last comment, know that time is over, because when you go into money, public funds, private funds, we meet people committed, and this means co-responsibilities, and not only to ambition to be part of. And this is new in the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Handing over to you, Ambassador Chinhoy. So when we look at the multilateral system, is the solution in minilateralism? Which is a term sometimes used for the informal groups that we have, the different Gs? Or how do you envisage taking forward the multilateral system to ensure that it is both equitable and inclusive and delivers on sustainable development goals, for example?
Thank you very much. From my point of view, when one looks at a world in considerable disarray, it is important to remember that geopolitical conflicts cannot really be wished away or prevented. What the world really needs to do is to think deeply about the kind of structures that we can create or improve upon that would be better able to either prevent or manage geopolitical conflicts. So therefore, it's instructive to look today at the experience of 100 years ago. When you look at the lessons of the 20th century, for me, it's very clear. The one big lesson is that without the fullest support of major powers, you really cannot have any effective multilateral structure. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 was a failure. So was the League of Nations that was attempted in 1920. And it did not succeed because the United States of America was never a member. And you can see that at the height of the League of Nations in the 1930s, between 1934 and 1935, there were actually 58 members, 7 more than the 51 members that created the United Nations in 1945. And yet the League of Nations was a complete failure because it was not able to prevent war, despite the Bryant-Kellogg Pact of 1928 signed in Paris. War could not be prevented. It could not prevent fascism. And therefore, in the 1930s, you could see how, firstly, Japan, Italy, Germany, much later in 1939, the Soviet Union, all left one by one. So that's a big lesson for me. The second big lesson is that despite the best of intentions on the part of major powers, you may be creating structures that may not be entirely very helpful or deeply thought through. Take the example of Franklin Roosevelt. Well before the Second World War ended, Roosevelt was speaking about the 4 policemen, that's the 4 sheriffs. He was talking about the spheres of influence that could be carved out by the 4 Globo Corps, that is the United States of America for the Western Hemisphere, the United Kingdom for Western Europe, China for East Asia and the Pacific, mind you. It's almost like prophetic in many ways, and the Soviet Union to look after East Europe. And this actually, at the end of the Second World War, led to a United Nations that is most inequitable. It started with inequity built into it. So I think best intentions also don't necessarily give you the best results without doing the kind of deep thinking that's required. My second point is that you don't need either minilaterals or maxilaterals. You need something that's balanced. Now take a look at the League of Nations. The League of Nations had no veto power, unlike this most inequitable UN Security Council at the moment. That's totally dysfunctional. And yet it failed. When you look at the G20, it's got the right kind of combination. It's got the BRICS in it, it's got the IBSA in it, it's got the G7 in it, it's got the P5 in it, and there is no veto. There's total equality. With the incoming of the African Union, you have another huge continent coming in. If the if the G20 were $85 trillion, 85% of the global economy of 100 trillion before the AU coming in, the AU has added US dollars 3.1 trillion. Now I think we have to caution ourselves here that if we have a good dream team like the G20, and you saw that it's a dream team from the unanimity achieved in Delhi, is it necessary then to think closely about other structures, kind of assuming that role and undermining the larger structure? It's food for thought. For example, the G7 must not act like the UN Security Council, nor should it act like the UN Security Council inside of the G20. Similarly, the BRICS, the expanded BRICS, I have a little doubt on that because the new president of Argentina, Javier Milei, has already spoken about, lack of enthusiasm for an expanded BRICS. And when you look at the BRICS with $27 trillion worth of an economy before the expansion, what you have by way of addition is another 3.1 coming in as a result of the 6 new ones, of which 1/3 is, of course, Saudi Arabia. Do we need to have parallel structures, or should we concentrate on the one good A team that we have managed to create, that's the G20? And I don't think I would bank on a grouping like the G77, 135 countries, including China. Frankly, it's too disparate. And these are countries that today face binary choices. They're not in a position to really make their voice felt the same way, precisely because the most important major powers are not part of the G77. So let's concentrate on the G20. This meeting is also about celebrating what we have achieved so far and taking stock of what needs to be done. Let's support Brazil and thereafter South Africa in making this G20 team the A team. No minis and no maxis required. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Andreas Schaal, you are representing an international organization on this panel, although it's one that has a very specific membership. And maybe from your perspective, and also, of course, from your experience as a G20 Sherpa for the organization, where do you see the role of perhaps picking up from Ambassador Chenoy, specifically the G20, in supporting effective multilateral system beyond the G20, and where do you, what are the conclusions you draw from the call for equity and such in regard to your own organization?
Thanks so much, Moira. Let me start by thanking ORF, Samir Saran, and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation for organizing this incredibly important conference. I think we need to have more of these exchanges between different groupings, between so-called North and South, and really just out of the plane after 12 hours from Paris, and tomorrow I go to Delhi, but it was incredibly important for me to come here to have this conversation. Second point, let me reformulate maybe your question a bit, if you allow me, because I grew up in Germany, and in my youth the predominant feature was East versus West. And today I'm living 500 meters away from a bridge which was used to exchange prisoners and spies between East and West Germany. And the mantra for our generation was always rise up to the challenge and then change is possible. And this is something which is also important as a mantra for our discussion here. And I really want to leave with you the thought, I don't think that, and I want to take it up from Suchan, I don't think that this antagonism and dualism, G7 versus G77, G7 versus BRICS, also North versus South, responds to the complexity of the challenges in our world, food security, climate change. And I want to, here I'm completely with Isabella, we need to think these things new, whether we have the format needed for each of the challenges. And we at the OECD, we propose for that. I mean, I agree with Suchan that the G20 is an incredibly important umbrella, even if hitchhiked Thabo by the heads of states. But also the heads of states bring dynamics, bring the need to kind of push for concrete examples, and India's presidency is one which delivered concrete examples. And we are happy to be, as OECD, the supporting cast. But what we are proposing at the OECD in this context is precise platforms for policy dialogue and joint action for advanced, emerging, and developing countries. And this does not matter that we have no universal membership, but the topics we are discussing has universal coverage. And I give you just one example before I stop. We have just launched 1 year ago a so-called Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches to have an economic and more honest exchange of views what countries are doing to reach their net zero emissions. And this is meant to have a real honest approach, and not that one group of countries tells another group, you need to have a price of carbon. There might be other alternatives who are equivalent to a price of carbon who lead to the same example. And I believe that we need to have more non-ideological, more pragmatic exchanges. And again, here I'm completely with Isabella, and I'll leave it there for this first round. Thanks so much. Hope that I did not deviate too much from your question, Madam Moderator.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for all the really valuable inputs. So one of the issues that we've touched upon over the last 24 hours and that might be worth taking a closer look, and you've mentioned the new development bank, Mrizi, is the multilateral development system, the multilateral development bank system. And I would like to maybe broaden this issue. We've touched upon IMF. We know that there have been some rather important reform steps taken at the World Bank, the annual meeting just a few weeks ago. But the system as such is more comprehensive. It includes much more levels, national developments, there are other regional development banks, of course. There are subnational developments of quite substantial size. How can we harness this system, and what is necessary to really address what President Mbeki yesterday mentioned about the funding gap, for example, regarding the SDGs? How can we increase the effectiveness of the multilateral development bank system? Is it new institutions we need? Is it better institutions we need? How can we address that the system as such works as a system, and that the different institutions deliver towards the common objectives. Please.
You know, the certain ideas are relevant at certain times. So if you were to ask me what is the most relevant question that confronts, say, the African continent now, I'll say the health care is really very important in Africa. Now, how do you achieve good health care? Well, then you go back to some of these things we're talking about. You go back to agriculture. You need food, healthy food. You need medical care, obviously. You need a population that's aware of its responsibility towards itself. So, what do you do? In Africa, we've got these vast resources, natural resources. Agriculture is very central, and we tend to ignore it, because food doesn't come from pick and pay. Food comes from the land, and the land must be tilled to produce this healthy food. But it doesn't help to have sufficient land for agriculture if we pollute the water and the rivers. Because then the food that is going to come from polluted water is of no use for healthcare. So instead of talking about these many goals that we have, I think we should just focus on some of the basic, simple things that we can do. And let's do them correctly. And by so doing, then add on the others as they come along. So I was saying at the beginning that certain ideas are relevant at certain times. Maybe when we were writing these Sustainable Development Goals, it was at a different time, written from New York by Jeffrey Sachs and so on. Okay. But we have to confront the African reality and the developing country reality and see to what extent maybe we can leverage the friendships that we have around the world for our common purposes. But let's focus on these basic things and do them very well. Of course, the question then arises, if you have produced these foodstuffs I'm talking about, how do they get to the market? That's infrastructure, which is critical in the process. So I think as developing countries, of course, the question arises, how are you going to finance infrastructure? How are you going to finance the tractors that you need for agriculture? And therefore, an institution like the New Development Bank becomes very important. But working together with the IMF and the World Bank and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Please, you'd like to pick up?
I have to answer this. Let's see. I'd like to highlight 2 or 3 things, because to answer your question, it's not only who, to whom, and why, okay, and how. Need to understand, okay, when you go into SDGs, I was a member of the panel of Secretary General that proposed Sustainable Development Goals. I was also the head of delegation, Brazil delegations, in charge of the Paris Agreement negotiation, as Nagoya Protocol, et cetera, et cetera. I can tell different stories here. All the political conditions that host us during these propositions, they are over. In less than 10 years, everything changed. So when you go into the debate of finance or even other things, we need to understand what are the demands, that are the priorities, if we want to deal with the future. And this is very important to observe. because you have inequalities, not only social ones. Infrastructure is a good example, technologies. But if you go into the technological trajectories, since Industrial Revolution, all the criteria that humankind adopt to share things from developed to developing worlds, this impact so bad that you provoke additional inequalities because of the criteria that you adopt to share technology in the past. You have different studies about these reports, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have today, exactly the convergence of climate age, bio-age that's emerging, and technological and digital age. And we are discussing if we have a bipolarized world between China and the United States. We're still discussing this. It's impressive how we like to put the coins in the wrong baskets. Because if we go into inequalities, and you need to understand this, we need to understand which countries in the world could provide solution short-term perspectives. I come from a country that were able to solve hunger. We eradicate hunger in Brazil. Why this is back? We eradicate extreme poverty. Why this is back? We are the key food producers in the world. Why you have hunger in a country like Brazil? It's not only income problems. These are political perspectives, political problems. That's the problem that we have in the financial world. Why would you like to finance things? We are proposing reform for multilateral institutions. Is the same institutions, or we have something fresh that allow us to access funds with transparency? Who will be able to be affordable to access these funds? We are doing the same project to make stronger the same institutions that the past were not able to solve the problems. Or you can be creative to come with new institutions. You can not only solve international reforms, you can go into multilateral systems, but we need to review institutions' capacity to deal with the challenge of this momentum in the world, not the challenge of the past. And we need to be coherent, because it's impressive that you don't have money to solve social inequalities or social risks, but you have money for wars with no barriers. It's impressive how people don't understand that climate change doesn't support wars anymore. Okay, I'm sorry, but we are really in a disruptive process in this planet, and we need to understand how we'll come into infrastructure and social inequalities to make sure that we're able not only to finance, and all of the argument is that the developing world, doesn't have capacity to provide projects. Why not? Tell me why not. But also, in our world, you need to face transparency, how to avoid corruption, how to go into the civil rights, how manage not only social inequalities, how go to preserve democracy. This is very important to understand when you go into multilateral systems, when you go to debate things. And my last comment here, we need to understand what the new generations are asking for. They're there, they're coming, and they want to be part of this. So when you go into the financial world, how we can solve problems, et cetera, and we have different reports. I'm a part of different reporters who consider climate finance, global finance. Let's assume something. Is development finance the same of climate finance today? If we want to bring private sector today together with us, that everyone likes to talk about this, but we are prepared to share responsibility with private sector. What it means? What did it mean? Carbon price, nature price. We are able to value price, to value nature, for example, to be able to pay for this. And this is very important, that you need to bring something very important to the room, trade, international trade. The countries that are producers and the countries that are consumers. And let's discuss this in a new framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And in the spirit of inclusivity, we would like to take questions from the floor. And so I'd like to ask the remaining two panelists to practice this solidarity and time management. Picking up on what we heard on the, we're looking at the question of how we can come up with new ideas, thinking afresh. I'm sure the T20 process has come up with many ideas. We've heard some of them this morning. The panel with the private sector was also very invigorating in that way. Ambassador Chino, would you like to maybe highlight a couple of the points?
Thank you. Well, just because the world is dysfunctional in terms of the multilateral system doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. What we really need to do is to try and improve upon the existing structures that we have. And so the first point is the UN Security Council. It's never been reformed except once in 1965 when the non-permanent category went up from 6 to 10, taking the total number from 11 to 15. And the intergovernmental negotiations since 2007 have gone nowhere. So I think we need to do something about that. The second point is with regard to the MDBs and the IFIs. And I have a view here that when we take a hard look at the IMF and see its lending capacity about $952 billion, of that, the SDRs are only 426 billion. The rest is bilateral arrangements or new arrangements to borrow, which really means that, once again, the developed countries are basically dictating terms there. And only once in 2007-8 have you seen voting rights being increased and an infusion of about $659 billion being made on a one-time basis at the end of the global financial and economic crisis. So I think the need of the hour is to see how we can expand this financial base that is available, get the IMF, the World Bank to work a little more closely with others like the ADB, the New Development Bank, etc. They work together and yet they don't, which also gives others, that is to say, country-specific banks from particular nations to actually overwhelm everything else. If you take a look at the 4 top banks of the People's Republic of China, you'll find that they have among themselves collectively capital worth roughly, market base there is something like $20 trillion. So if the bilateral track overwhelms the multilateral track, it's not good for the global system. And I think, therefore, we need to work together. The last point I'd make is that military expenditures have gone up by 3.7% year on year recently to touch $2.25 trillion in 2022. And by 2030, the world is going to need $5 trillion annually for climate finance alone. So it's time that we stop fighting wars to divert this capital to developmental finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite people from the audience who would like to raise questions. There are microphones left and right. Please make your way to the microphone if you have an interest in that. While we listen to Andreas Schall on this same topic, if you don't mind. I know the OECD is also strongly involved in the finance track of the G20, and that with your research and you have also given substantial impetus on this question. So where would you sort of pinpoint the most immediate efforts for effective financing?
Okay, Madam Moderator, let me just make 2 points in 60 seconds. First, climate finance. We are tracking the $100 billion commitment of advanced economies to developing countries. Data from 2021 show that we're coming closer, but we are not yet there. So we are now close to 86 million. But we need to kind of step up the efforts here, and we're tracking this. We also need to bring in more private finance, meaning that we leverage public with private finance. We have developed for the G20 in Indonesia, G20 blended finance principles. We are working as secretariat for the Paris Finance Summit, so we kind of try to really advance there. And second point I want to make is the point of domestic resource mobilization. Since 2009, we're working for the G20 with 169 countries in the Global Forum on Automatic Exchange of Tax Transparency, and there's Tito Mbobeni was minister when we kind of further advanced this exercise. And we have been bringing with this exercise that everybody pays its fair share, 1.7 billion euros to African countries in terms of domestic resource mobilization. And now we are working on the next step with the corporate minimum tax of 15%, making sure that big companies pay their fair share also in Africa. And this is something which is our contribution to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It seems like our audience is fully satisfied with the comments that have been made on the panel, or does anyone like to raise a question or make a comment? Sorry? They're hungry. Okay. So when we had the red eye session last night, this might be the empty stomach session. So then please do join me applauding this panel for the excellent comments they've made. I think I can summarize it that we, other than some other voices we've heard in the last 24 hours, I think the panel agrees in a very substantial but rather reform than a revolution in the multilateral system, and is definitely willing to contribute to taking this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, moderator, and all the speakers. Thank you so much, and we're on time as well. If I could request all of you for a quick photograph. We have one more session to go before we close for lunch. This one is called Cross-Border Cooperation, Pathways to Conflict Resolution. I think Ambassador Chinoy during this particular session did mention that we need to stop ending wars and divert capital and resources towards development. We will be talking about how we can stop these wars. On the panel, we'll have the former president of Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson. We will have the former Assistant Secretary General, Department of Global Security and Safety at the UN, Mabaranga Gasarabwe. And we'll have the former High Commissioner of Tanzania to South Africa and Chairman of Kilombero Sugar Company, Ami Mbegwe. Moderator, Pauline Bax, Deputy Director, Africa Program at the International Crisis Group. We're just getting the stage all freshened up, and we'll then call the speakers in. In the meantime, I just wanted to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. Post this session, we do break for lunch, and we go down to Hall 5 where we all had dinner. Post lunch, we'll have 2 sessions, one in this room and a roundtable discussion on the third floor. So do pick and choose where you want to go. The session here will be on how the youth can catalyze change, and upstairs in the roundtable room, it will be on multilateralism and SDGs. If I could request my colleagues to please escort the speakers inside. Next session, Cross-Border Cooperation, Pathways to Conflict Resolution. Cross-border cooperations, how can we resolve conflicts? On the panel, former President of Liberia, Madam Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, the former Assistant Secretary General, Department of Global Security and Safety, the United Nations, Mabaranga Gasarbe, the former High Commissioner of Tanzania to South Africa, Ambassador Ami, and moderated by Pauline Bax, Deputy Director, Africa Program at the International Crisis Group. Madam President, please. And the second chair. As we mentioned in the previous session, we do have 5 minutes for audience comments, so there are mics on either side. You can queue up there beforehand as well, so that the moderator has an indication in case you want to make a comment. Moderator, over to you.
So this session is about working together across borders and exploring the potential of working together. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll launch as soon as possible into the questions. We have in recent years seen a resurgence of conflict, I think, around the world, and there's against a backdrop of a fracturing of the multilateral space. This has made it very difficult for organizations like the UN to play a leading role in finding global security solutions. We also see an emergence of new actors, especially in Africa. I'm mostly focused on Africa, so sorry, my questions will be mostly about Africa. And so against this difficulty of finding global or African security solutions, we see an emergence of new actors who also play a role on the global stage. For example, the UAE or Turkey and Saudi Arabia have all now are part of this global world where we all try to find solutions. I would like to start with Madam President. This search for global security solutions has become very difficult, and wars are on the increase, or we have the impression that there's more conflicts recently, and they're very hard to resolve, as we can see from various conflicts today. What is your experience with conflict resolution and the fracturing of the multilateral space? How do you see that? Can we talk about a fracturing of multilateral space?
You would like for me to start first?
Yes, please.
Very well. Let's put the whole idea about global cooperation, effectiveness in development, effectiveness in security, into a historical context. Post-World War II, 4 major institutions, global institutions, were organized to promote development and security. The Bretton Woods institutions, International Monetary Fund and World Bank, to ensure economic growth. The Security Council, to ensure peace and security in the world. The United Nations through the General Assembly, to ensure solidarity and collective action with a common purpose. But over the years, there's been an evolution in such a way that in Africa, for example, we have gone through the processes of liberation, of big man syndrome, militarism, and we've also, over the years, developed adherence to democratic principles. On the other side, the other regions, we saw effective multilateralism that was applied largely through bilateral relationships and multilateralism through, again, the 2 primary global financial institutions, World Bank and IMF. The changes that occur in evolution is that a fragmentation of the global leadership led to issues in which the effective commitment to democracy and was undermined, and that also had its effect in Africa, as we've seen 8 coups d'etats within the past decade or so. I think we're at the place in the world where COVID-19 and the effect of COVID-19 has changed the thinking and brought to fore a commitment to a new global agenda, a global agenda that goes past the multilateral development goal, sustainable development goal, to the point today where we're talking about more effective multilateralism and a more secured world through a changed peace and security, through changed global financial architecture, through addressing matters relating to global public goods, such as the threats of climate change, artificial intelligence, ensuring that the Security Council are changed. So we're just in a changing world in which Africa also has to find its voice through our own regional institution, to the Africa Free Trade Agreement, and through ensuring that we have, through our regional institutions, whether it's the multilateral banks or whether it's our regional political institutions coming out of the African Union, that we are able to have a voice in this new evolution of a world that's going to be changed in significant ways. So, let me say that I think much has been said today from the panels that preceded ours, and what they have tabled are just another example of the way the world is changing and the responses that are required if Africa is to maintain a place being what we call the continent of the future. So you can pass on to somebody else.
Thank you. Ambassador Mpungwe, you've been instrumental in negotiations across the continent, notably in Rwanda, and you're, I think, locally in Tanzania as well. In the mining sector, you have a lot of experience, and your country is also involved in a stabilization mission right now in the neighboring country, Mozambique. You have a lot of experience with mediating and negotiating. However, today, I think globally, it's very difficult to find effective mediators who are accepted by all the parties in conflict. What is your experience with mediation, and what does it take to be a good negotiator or mediator?
Thank you. I think, first of all, I want to state that there have been a number of conflicts in Africa, and there continue to be some. But to a great extent, we were able to resolve, to deal and resolve our own conflicts. To the extent that the factors were the African factors. And we had no shortage of those sources of conflict because, as you would appreciate, most of the colonial borders that we inherited in Africa were very arbitral. They never made any ethnic or tribal or economic or geographical sense. So the colonial borders by themselves, the way the countries were formed in Africa was conflictful. You find different tribes crossing different borders. And then we ended up with the vagaries of the Cold War, which also caused a lot of tensions in Africa. And if you could recall, there were a lot of coups and violent changes in a number of countries in Africa. But we still were able to develop our own internal capacity to resolve some of these conflicts, especially in this part of Africa, the Southern Africa, and through the frontline states. We were able to support various liberation processes, but also resolving a number of conflicts. And as you mentioned, personally, I was very much involved, apart from the frontline states' activities, to bring liberation and independence in a number of countries around here. But I was specifically involved with the mediation of the Rwandese conflict in 1992-93. And indeed, we were able to, it was a difficult conflict, it's a deep-rooted conflict. characterized by very emotional issues, but we in Tanzania, assisted by neighboring countries, but with the very active involvement of the continental organization, the OAU, then now AU, we were able to pull through a peace agreement, but as the global peacemaking procedures and architecture it is, we also had expected, and it was organized in such a way the UN would have come in to implement the peace agreement that we achieved in Arusha during the 13 months that we negotiated the peace deal. But it was a lack of, timeless response on the part of the UN. The peace process collapsed at the cost of 1 million people, which is the saddest part of my experience in dealing with the conflicts in Africa.
But so what, according to you, takes a good mediator? What's essential for a good mediator in conflict?
I think it depends on, you have to understand the character and nature of the conflict. It's not one size fits all. In the case of my experience with the Rwandese conflict, it is a deep-rooted conflict. And we had to develop a different model for it. At that time, the common model in Africa, whenever a crisis happens, the heads of state would fly in at a certain country, sit there for a few hours, discuss, and come with resolutions, and they fly back. But in the case of Rwandese conflict, which we classified as deep-rooted conflict, we changed the model. We had to reserve heads of state and foreign ministers and prime ministers, use them as lever for change. Whenever we got stuck, we would go to the foreign ministers or to the prime ministers or to the president. But what we did, we established camp, so to speak. We all were in Arusha, and we would negotiate different phases. There was a lot of groundwork that we did. I had a team of seven assistants to assist, but also other institutions like the Ministry of Defense, our intelligence department, our home affairs, and others who also came to assist us. But we were there in Arusha permanently for about 13 months. So we only referred to the foreign ministers or to the presidents when we got stuck. We were using them as a four-wheel drive, so to speak. So if it's not difficult enough, we refer to the foreign ministers, but if it is difficult, you go to the higher authorities.
So mediation requires commitment, and
It
it's a long-haul process.
And you wanted to know, there are so many people in Africa who have been involved, but I think people occupy situations and move on. When I did that, I was in the diplomatic service. I'm no longer there. Maybe my records are not available in that sense. But a number of people in Africa who have been involved in resolving different conflicts, I think it is important for whatever structures that we have, keep an inventory of those talents or those skills and apply them whenever they're needed.
I have so many more questions for both of you, but I'm going to turn now to Ms. Kasarambwe, who spent a lot of time in Mali as a deputy, sorry, it's a very long title, Deputy Special Representative of the MINUSMA, which I'm not going to spell out, the peacekeeping mission, stabilization mission in Mali. And in some way, the stabilization mission was a success in the sense, I think, that a lot of countries pulled together to contribute to the success of the mission. Countries both from the north, the west, the south, and the east. However, the mission is now almost done withdrawing, and we see a resurgence of war. What do you think comes next? What should be the next step, especially for countries who face a asymmetric conflict in the sense, of terrorism, or we should say maybe jihadism? which are different conflicts than the conventional kind of warfare that the UN initially addressed?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me give a special tribute to this distinguished tribune we have here. President Ellen Sirleaf was involved very much. We're together in New York, and he was the head of Africa Bureau. Ambassador, you heard about the negotiation he did in Rwanda, and I'm Rwandese. So I know exactly 94 happened when I was in New York under President Sirleaf leadership before she became president. So we went through a crisis. And after this crisis, we had other crises. So we're dealing with the crisis in Africa. 94, 96, it was a terrible one. Rwanda, Congo, then Central African Republic, the mutiny, and so on. And later on, you see, we're in 94, we're talking 94, and now we're in 2023. We still have some conflict in Africa, unsolved and other solved. And I think there's a lot of lesson learned for people who want really to see what happened when there's a crisis and when the crisis happened, and to go back, the history and the whole geographical dimension. Why we have a cross-border problem, why we have a Sahel region now, we're going to go to Mali. But I just want to say that each country cannot say, I'm stable and they're going to continue to be stable. Because I was in Mali as the resident coordinator, the head of UN, in 2011. It was a stable country. Mali was given as one of the good governance example in West Africa. And I think they start managing the crisis, even though there was a north-south separation. But then I was appointed as Assistant Secretary General for Global Security. When I came to New York, I started looking at the report coming from Mali. There's a crisis coming up. There's a terrorist coming up. And who have followed the Mali situation has seen also the whole collapse of Libya and the whole management of African Union who tried to really tamper the crisis in Mali when we have the rebellion movement. But there was definitely, the North-South had the problem, but it was not such a big issue. They were trying to solve it. And suddenly, 2013, my goodness, the whole collapse, terrorist group occupying the north, and starting talking about peacekeeping mission. Who can say that Mali at that time, the good governance, quote to quote, was coming a peacekeeping mission, or the forces coming, and who knows the arrival of the peacekeeping mission knows also how the peacekeeping are governed. We're talking about African Union, we're talking about the dynamic of regional dimension, we're talking about the people who understand the region and can dialogue. But when it comes to the peacekeeping, we're ruled by the Security Council, taking resolution. And sometimes the mission work towards the reporting to the Security Council and they take the resolution again for the mission. We thought there was a small conflict when stabilization, meaning that the ports can come, and we have to take also the approach of a multidimensional approach. When we have to deal with the crisis, you have the humanitarian, people are displaced, you have to deal with the humanitarian dimension. You have to deal with the development, because when people also don't have water, energy, whatever, you have to deal with that, so development dimension. You have to deal also with the people who have been killed probably by the armed forces, and the justice and the reconciliation and all these kind of things. So it became like a dimensional approach. But then who knows very well, the UN knows that there's a secretary of a Security Council, and there is the agencies and the humanitarian trying to act. But the voice of reporting is the Security Council. And then there is an approach of saying, who's going to dialogue and make sure that those forces, the terrorist group are there? What will happen? And I'm coming back to, while in this session, talking the innovative approach. Don't think about the expert, the mission. It's going to solve the problem. In my view, it's the people inside. They've lived together for many years. Look at Mali, how it was a fantastic country for centuries and so on. But what happened when you started dividing the north, the center, the south, and people believing that they are antagonists. And I think that's where we have to rethink the stability. The stability, you can have forces, defense. And we have, by the way, from one national forces to 34 contingents coming from Cambodia, coming from Bangladesh, coming from wherever. And you think that the people will understand the dynamic inside? Yes, it's our responsibility that they have the mission, but you have such a big dynamic. And I think the rethinking stability, as you said, is to go back again to the population we serve. What is happening there? Are the national forces, security, working with the population? Are the population looking at them as the people they can trust? We had a case just on the cross-border on Mauritania, because the Sahel region is so interconnected. And you know, when we ask them why those terrorists also can move around, and there's a trafficking, there is a lot of, how do you make your region stable? They say, listen, we had a system on security. When there is a small radio and small telephone, we distribute it to all local entities, and whenever, and we sensitize the population. Security is your security, but it's you who have to take the lead. When someone comes to the region, the local one, the chief, the imam, and the people, mosque on Friday, they have, and they were talking about your own security, grassroots level, women, youth, security involved. If you see someone coming, the Sahel region is like, you see who's coming, and from far, and someone say, I see someone I don't know. Could you just see what's happening? So you have like the trust between the security forces and the population. Population is really new. Second, is also those population, when they see that you are the completely don't have anything to eat, anything, you don't care about them. Of course, when these forces came, they tried to be the nice guy, the humanitarian savior. And of course, they recruited the local entities, especially the youth, and they became part of the terrorists. So I think one of the aspects I like very much during the negotiation was to say, why don't we bring together, while the government is looking at the SSR, security sector reform, but let us look at the entities, the local entities, and look at how we can build this trust and have the civilian and the forces together with a dialogue, and see how also we have the regional entities, including the head of state, including all the dynamic, to come and help. And at the same time, that's why I said this multidimensional approach, you also serving the local communities to provide the basic needs. And I do think that I clearly want to come back to this rethinking stability. I was approached by, I think, Atlantic Council and the CIPRI, those two think tanks, rethinking stability in the peacekeeping mission today. I think if we are ignoring that dynamic of local entities, that dynamic of the negotiator, the peace builder, we are totally out. And I think that's where we deal with maybe reforming the Security Council is understanding, even though you have a report, but think what are really you building on the ground. I think that's very, very important. And I was just discussing yesterday with a fantastic youth group dynamic here, building what they call the tree. I don't know if they're here, but really I want to give the credit. It's like how each person from Sahel region was trying to see the youth movement, the women movement, and I give also the credit to the women in the Mano River, how they also stabilized the region. So I see that when we have like lesson learned from the previous crisis, like I was in Guinea also before Mali, when there was Liberia, Sierra Leone, and the Guinea in a crisis, but the region is stabilized. So it's also so to see where are we today with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And very ironically, is the army groups. The head of state these days are from military system. Something has to be looked at. But at the same time, I was very surprised last time to hear that one region called Kidal, which is very close to Algeria, the south of Algeria, was supposed to be the terrorist hub. Nobody can go there. The army from Mali cannot go there. But we just heard recently that they managed to go there. So something is being built probably on negotiation of local entities, on a national level, and the region are getting probably stabilized. Let's see, hope that probably there will be a lead from our military group, military leadership to the civilian, but together building a nation which can be again stable.
Let's talk a little bit about the African leadership experience. You had asked me to talk about Liberia. Liberia experience is a very clear example of how African leaders had come together in collective action. Liberia had the largest peacekeeping force, and it's only because the leaders of ECOWAS, the leaders of the West African nations, were able to come together and put in soldiers. It was supported by the United Nations through the peacekeeping force, but they were the ones that led the action that were able to bring out 2 decades of civil war to an end. We also, as was mentioned by her, the Ebola experience about effective collective cross-border action, in which the African leaders, through the African Union summit meeting, decided that they were going to support the young people of Africa to come in partnership with the young people in the 3 affected countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Cote d'Ivoire, to be able to bring the Ebola tragedy to an end. And through that means also the 3 affected countries being able to organize joint security measures, joint communication methods, were then able to work together and to be able to end the Ebola in the shortest period of time, Liberia being most affected, but the one that ended it first before the other 2, even though in each country, in our country, over 5,000 people had died. And I think if you all recall COVID-19 and that experience, it was the African leadership that put together the first means of being able to mobilize the resources for vaccines that would be able to be taken to our country. And they organized a panel for being able to get from Africa's corporate leaders to be able to provide those resources much before we were able to get the responses from the West, and to start the process of being able to have manufacturing units in Africa so that Africa could have its vaccines. But with all of that, we still were not able to get vaccines because of the infrastructure constraints. This is why the experience of beginning to look today at global action and to introduce the changes in global action that are going to lead it. Today we have what in effect are global wars, Ukraine, Palestine, and Israel. And we've not been able to get the Security Council to take the necessary action through dialogue, through measures. This is why to be able to get a new world order in peace and security, you have to have the participations of regional institutions. You need to find the measures whereby there's more prevention than there is cure when it comes to conflict. And this call for a new global order is something in which Africa has to play and is playing a leading role. We cannot continue to have a world in which the domination is by the few powers in which the people themselves who will be affected by decisions and policies that are formulated somewhere do not have a say, do not have a place. We cannot continue to have a world that cannot address those that have been marginalized, whether we're dealing with women or whether we're dealing with youth. This is why the call today for effective peace and security is to ensure that the Security Council has representation from other regions. And fortunately, a decision has been taken to make sure that Africa Union has a seat on the Security Council. We cannot have a world order in which the resources of the world are held by only the institutions of the global north and the global south excluded. We have to have, you cannot have SDR allocation, which provides the financial resources for development, has to be held by the major richer countries of the world. And when there's a threat like COVID-19, we do not have the means to have equitable and scaled resources for the poorer countries. That's why we need to change the overall global financial architecture. Today, where does capital resources lie? Where is the money in the world? It's held by the private sector. It's held by private corporations. And again, a new financial architecture is going to ensure that there's a blending of resources. That is what is called the Bridgetown Initiative, in which that blending of resources that come through bilateral arrangements, multilateral arrangements, are then twinned with private sector, private capital, that would be at a scale where countries can develop more, where you do not have the ownership of these institutions controlled by the global north, so that the global south too has representation in each of those institutions. And so if I talk about this, is because today this is essentially the agenda of the world. The time for change has come, and these changes have to take place where people are going to be able to be a part of those processes. The fragmentation that we have today in the global political order needs to change. It's changed because the dominating powers have been weakened over time by the growth of other institutions that have been able to do more in terms of having strong economic growth, being able to promote their own prosperity, but not today being able to have a voice. And so if I stray from the topic of just trying to promote effective transboundary thing and talk about wanting to do with global issues, is because the time has come for that. The time to be able to change the structure of the world has come. That's because the threat of the world, look at COVID-19. Nobody would have thought when it started that it would have so penetrated the entire world. The major countries did not react until it became a global threat. And this is why today we have the effort is made to create the vaccines, to create the preventive things in the health sector to be able to respond to that. So if I'm taking too much of their time because of these things, it's simply because we've reached that stage in the world where we have to now, Africa is moving toward finding its role as the continent of the future, finding its role through collective action, through more effective regionalization and regional integration, to find that common voice, to be able to take its rightful place in the discussion, in the discourse of nations about what the global agenda should be, how should global resources, how should inequities and injustices be addressed. I think those are the issues that bind us all when we make those decisions as African leaders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the organizers to see if we can have 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Is there time for that?
Maybe
yes.
Thank you very much. The name once again is Kefenza Mkari from the OR Tambo School of Leadership. I think that we'll continue to have conflicts for as long as the application of international law is not consistent, but also the double standards that come with it, where on the one hand you have international law applied as a corrective measure for countries of the north, but as a punitive measure for countries in the south. But equally, we will continue having these conflicts if we don't come up with proper accountability measures to ensure that we hold each other accountable with the right consequence measures. So my question is, how do we ensure the consistent application of international law, and how do we challenge the double standards that we're seeing, particularly from the north? And lastly, what kind of institutions do we need to develop in order to hold each other accountable on the commitments that we make? Thank you very much.
Who would like to take that question?
Well, I'll make a quick attempt and then leave it to my colleagues. I think you're right. The differential application of international law and all other corrective measures, it certainly says that we need a new architecture of global peace and security that is recognizes the diversity and it's inclusive and does not apportion or limit power to few and few powerful countries alone. We need to change that architecture for global peace and security at the global level, and that should also apply to the regional organizations. But certainly for us in Africa, apart from these other interventions to guarantee sustainable peace and stability, we also have to make some decisive interventions in dealing with unsustainable levels of poverty that characterize a number of our countries and therefore cause tensions and conflicts among ourselves. And also invoke new ways of dealing with these conflicts, including applying multi-stakeholder approaches involving the private sector and civil society. And in some of the conflicts we find could be civil societies causing them or instigating them, or the private sector of, want for resources that end up causing conflicts on the continent. So a number of interventions that are very creative, very innovative, need to be put in place in dealing with the conflicts going forward.
The enactment and enforcement of international law has to start at the national level. It has to start with laws that are based on policies of protection and policies of justice. And if nationally they are respected and are implemented, then naturally you see it move. It also has to take place at regional levels. We have our regional parliamentarian groups. We have resolutions that are done by the African Union for the protection of women, protection against violence. And again, they have to be domesticated nationally and enforced if you wanted to. So an international law at the level of the global setting is primarily the International Criminal Court. And we know that not all the countries, the major countries, some countries like the United States and Israel have not agreed to become a member into the enforcement and the acceptance of the rules of the International Criminal Court. And so we have not been able to see the adherence of that. But you're absolutely right, the African Union, the other regional institutions are the ones to be able to ensure that rules that protect people, safety rules, are adhered to. And if not adhered to, there needs to be a criteria. That's where the Security Council comes in. The Security Council is right now not operating at a level where they can lead the action of ensuring international law is respected and implemented. Again, I think it's a matter of being able to react to these changing times and to change the institutions.
Let me just, sorry to come back to my country because I think genocide against Tutsi in 1994 was a shame for everybody. But when it comes to the international law, when everything was done, the shameful stuff was done, and a million people were killed, there was a same thing to say, well, how are you going to solve the problem? But among all these they have solved in Rwanda, and the international community was not there. They even left. But then the Rwandese get together and they build something called Agachacha. Agachacha is the seed. It's again getting back to the local grassroots and building what happened in history, many years of solving problems. But that was a shame because the people used to live together. And they went back to the culture of saying, if people, it's a kind of, they call it the 1,000 hills. People just go to do the agriculture, but at the end of the afternoon, they sit together, they start talking, the kids are playing around, and they say the only thing which can reconcile these people, it was the tribal, ethnic stuff, and which has been created, a long story of colonialism and the other stuff. But people are unique. They have the same language, same religion, same culture. There is a way to build on that. Agachacha was fighted by international law. People didn't want to ask, they said, what are you going to do? You're not going to solve your problem. But Rwanda stand up and say, we're going to use Agachacha. And Agachacha today is the way of people on a local level sitting together, women, youth, elders, and speak about the problem. How can we live together? You killed my parents. I killed your sister. But we still have to live together. Of course, there's a lot of national reconciliation. There's a lot, maybe President Ellen can say that's a lot what has been done. But I think I go back to this international law versus the local laws and means of living together. Because at the end of the day, international community will come, they will leave, but people will stay together. How you build up this sustainable peace is exactly to the entities, and making sure the leadership is always a group entities, the local authorities, the national authorities, the regional who are in mediation, continue to say never again. Never again is built up on this level, community level, and up. And of course, education is key, civil engagement, because if you are not leaving people like that, they will kill each other again. If you close the eyes and you don't pay attention to good governance, they will be killing each other again. So all together, as I said, the multidimensional approach is why you solve this justice, social justice. You build up also economic development within the entities to make sure that today, I will not come to kill you because we have a business together. We are building business together. We are more focusing on how we're going to build up our system, economic system, to make sure that our children are educated, and we have a health system, and we have all these basic things we are talking about. So I still believe that building this justice and the national reconciliation goes with all the focus again of development, justice, leadership goes with the local governance, national governance, regional governance. And we do those crises which remain today is because you hate, you cultivate the hate among population. Who's to kill who? Is again your neighbor. So we really need to pay attention to that one, and I think this is why I'm continuing to say, everybody who's here, who's thinking about innovative approach, the youth, the women, everybody, we need to continue to look at how do we solve the problem of crisis, small conflict, which can become tomorrow another big crisis. So I come back again to that. I think it's a multidimensional approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand that the time is up, but thank you very much for your contributions today.
Thank you so much, panelists, Madam President, Madam Assistant Secretary General, Ambassador, sir. If I could request you to join us for a quick photograph. And while we conclude this session, we also take a break for lunch. Lunch is served in hall number 5, where we ate dinner yesterday. So please do make your way to hall number 5 for lunch. Post-lunch, at 3:25, we reconvene here. That's when we start this plenary session called Shooting Stars, Igniting a Youth-Powered Development Pathway. We also have a roundtable titled Multilateralism in Action, Aligning Global Platforms for Advancing SDGs. That's upstairs on the 3rd floor. If I could request everyone to please reconvene here or at the roundtable room by 3:15, 3:20. That will allow us to start at 3:25 sharp. We now break for lunch, hall 5. Please do not forget your badges. Access is restricted, so we will need your badges on you when you do come back to the venue. Thank you so much and do enjoy your lunch.